But tonight, I just want to say, if you were biting your fingernails, worried about the world, worried about America, can we ever get anything done, and you watch this president tonight, this is a president that was finding common ground and speaking common sense and trying to turn common pain into common purpose. And that's what you need right now.
David, you worked in the White House, so maybe you can give me a little appreciation of this. A lot of us, including a lot of U.S. officials today, were bracing for a heavy Russian assault during the course of the president's address, the State of the Union address. They thought there would be explosions and sirens going off and bombs while the president was speaking. It was totally quiet by our reporters' accounts over there, which I'm sure says something about the Russian intention right now. Why were they effectively, sort of respectful of what the president was doing?
Here's what I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that Biden and his team probably know more than we do about that, because they, I'm sure he was being briefed right up to going in, and I'm sure they weren't thrilled about the idea of a split screen situation where he was delivering the State of the Union and, a massacre was taking place in Ukraine. I suspect they knew when he got on that platform what the situation was. Let me just say one thing. You say I worked in that White House. I just feel like I have to say that sometime during this discussion. The thing I hated the most when I worked in the White House was working day and night on a speech and everything else you're working on, and then having ex-White House aides like me say, here's what they should have done, and I appreciate that, and I think that there's a lot that was accomplished tonight. I just think that there is an urge to accomplish too much, and that can sometimes reduce the impact of what you're doing.
Now we'll wait to see what the Russians are up to in the coming hours. Jake, back to you.
Thanks, Wolf. We're getting the first results of our poll of Americans who watched President Biden's speech tonight. David Chalian is here with the numbers. David.
Jake, we first should note this is not a poll, obviously, of all Americans. That would not be possible here. This is a poll of people who watched the speech. And what's important to note about that is that people who watch a president give a State of the Union tend to be more supportive of that president or in that president's party. We see this with Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. And so our survey tonight of speech watchers is about 11 points more Democratic as a body of people here that were polled than the overall population in America. So just keep that in mind as we now show you what this instant reaction was of speech watchers tonight. 41% had a very positive reaction to the president's speech. 29% somewhat positive, 29% negative. That 41%, when you compare it to last year's speech that Joe Biden gave to a joint session of Congress, that's about 10 points lower on the very positive scale. 51% last year, you see 41% today. In fact, that 41% is the lowest very positive we've seen in about the last 15 years of instant polling after the State of the Union address. Take a look at this question here. We said, did Biden do enough to address some of the major issues here? On Russia's invasion of Ukraine, 69% said the president did enough to address that. But look at this. For the domestic issues that the White House is so keenly aware of in this midterm election year that are potential problems for Biden, they still seem to be problems. 47% said he did enough on inflation. 46% said he did enough on violent crime. Majorities for both inflation and violent crime said he did not do enough. And again, I just want to remind you, that is the majority of a speech-watching audience that is more Democratic than the American populace overall. Keep that in mind as you look at that. How about changing your level of confidence in the way Biden is handling the situation in Ukraine? After the speech tonight, these watchers said 30% of them are more confident in his ability and in his ability to handle the situation in Ukraine. Only 14% less confident, but the vast majority had no change of mind in their confidence level of how Joe Biden is handling the Ukraine situation. And then you want to take a look at which speech topic is more important to you, the economy or Ukraine. This explains why 12 minutes of a 62-minute speech was dedicated to Ukraine, and the other 50 minutes were dedicated to other things, because 64% of speech watchers say the economy is more important. 36% say Ukraine was the more important issue.
So generally speaking, These are lower marks than you would expect from such a disproportionately Democratic audience?
We've seen over the last year Joe Biden take a slide in the polls. There's no doubt about it. He's not just taking a slide with the overall public, he's also taking a slide, and I think this reflects that, the instant reaction to the speech, with people who are even supportive of him or who are in his party. And I think, that is what these numbers reflect, is that he obviously has been on the decline. There's nothing in this speech that suggests he turned that around entirely. I don't think that was the expectation. I don't think that's a realistic expectation for this speech. But clearly, that decline in popularity that we've seen, we're seeing it across the board.
And what's interesting about that, Dana, also is I think that it's, I'm not telling tales out of school, that his numbers when it comes to inflation and violent crime are much, much more important as to what happens in the midterm elections this November, and also what happens to his reelection should he run for reelection in 2024. Most people are not going to be voting for a president on foreign policy.
Inflation and the broader issues of the economy, how people feel about their pocketbooks, and how people feel about their neighborhoods, worry about crime, that's the political ballgame. That is what every member of Congress, Democratic and Republican member of Congress, will tell you that they believe that voters are going to be caring the most about when they decide whether Republicans should take the majority in the House and in the Senate. And they know that on Capitol Hill. They very much know that at the White House, which is why as you said, David, as much as understandably, it's understandable that everybody is focused on Ukraine and that the president started there, but that the bulk of his speech was about that. And just one quick thing on that, the crime number, the fact that the president didn't just distance himself from defund the police, which he did throughout the entire primary season. He never embraced that. In fact, he was very much saying he didn't support it, but that he used the term fund the police, he turned it on his head. That tells you everything you need to know about where the Democrats think they are on this issue politically.
Although I have to say, and Dana, you were making this observation earlier, it is amazing to me, Governor Reynolds talking about parents' rights, talking about education seen through that lens. President Biden did talk about the importance of schools staying open in the context of COVID, and he did talk about increasing funding. But Democrats seem to consistently see this idea of parents' rights and parents' involvement in schools to Republicans. Republicans are taking up the mantle of this, of parents' rights. Parents get to have a say. Democrats seem to just not even say anything about it. Right. And we saw how well that worked out for the Democrats when a Republican took control of the governor's mansion in Virginia.
They're talking to voters about two completely different sets of issues, and that could not have been more apparent tonight. And you're right. I mean, Democrats, by and large, just ignore it. They don't respond to it. They don't push back on it. They just ignore the arguments being made on so-called parents' rights, because what Republicans are calling parents' rights seem to only refer to certain kinds of parents. Not talking about the parents who maybe do want their kids to wear masks or to learn about race in schools, et cetera. But Democrats aren't talking about those issues, and I think it's because they think that if they engage on it, they will give it more credence than they want to give it.